Okay, so my name is Toge Haidt, and I'm having the pleasure of being the new director of the Keynes Fund. So, if you don't know it, the Keynes Fund was established in 2012 in the Faculty of Economics. It supports research on the sources and consequences of market institutional failure and trying to find ways of improving the world by coming up with new mechanisms and new policies that can help us solve these problems. It is my real great pleasure this afternoon to welcome our third Keynes lecturer, and it's a particular pleasure to introduce Christina to give us the lecture. She's the professor of, the Garth Wilson Professor of Economics, it's a bit of a mouthful there, at the University of California at Berkeley. Now, Christina's academic record is truly impressive, and the research is centered on the understanding of recessions in the world economic policy in reducing the impact of negative shocks. She was at the eye of the storm when the financial crisis broke out in 2007-8 and was instrumental in developing the US government's recovery plan the following year, before she was appointed as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in 2009 by the Obama administration. Her influential research on macroeconomic fluctuations in monetary and fiscal policy brings together economic theory, statistical testing, and economic history to form a very powerful framework. Her works on the causes of the Great Depression in the 1930s have significantly shifted our understanding of what caused the recession and what role fiscal policy in particular played in the recovery. Her more recent work with David Romer, who's also here today, sitting over there, focuses, among other things, on the role of tax policy in fighting recessions. So many tax changes are endogenous functions of what happens in the economy, and therefore it's extremely hard to work out, to isolate what the effect they might have on the economy and other factors. And the exciting innovation in Christina's work with David is to use non-statistical information in order to break the impacts. This narrative approach, which is going to be the subject of this lecture, is to use other sources, what is reported in the newspapers, in minutes of meetings and so on, to help us overcome this significantly and very difficult causation problem. And I'm actually pleased to say that the Keynes Fund in the past have funded research in this space. Now, without further ado, I'll hand over the floor to Professor Christina Romer to give a lecture.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Let me start by saying just what an incredible honor it is to give this year's Keynes lecture. So, as a macroeconomist with special interest in economic policy, there really can be no greater honor than to speak at Cambridge in a lecture that has the name Keynes somewhere in the title. But I'm also delighted to be here to support the important work being done by Cambridge economists. The financial crisis and the terrible worldwide recession that followed showed that modern economics was in need of some important rethinking. And Cambridge and the Keynes Fund have been at the very forefront of this effort. So it is truly a pleasure to be here and to have spent a week here with the fine economists here. All right, so in my lecture this afternoon, I want to discuss the fundamental challenge of establishing causation in macroeconomic relationships. So economic theories, such as that set down by Keynes, posit a causal relationship between key economic variables. So, for example, Keynes derived a very famous framework in which changes in interest rates brought about by decisions of the central bank cause changes in investment, output, and employment. And there may be feedback effects, there may be general equilibrium constraints, but in the model, there's a clear causal relationship running from monetary developments to the real economy. All right, well, then it then falls to empirical researchers to see if the hypothesized causal relationships are confirmed by the data, right? And only then will we know if the theory's correct and be able to make good policy recommendations. Unfortunately, it's in this empirical step where an American might say the wheels often come off the wagon. Because in the sciences, or even in some subfields of economics, it's possible to run experiments to actually determine causation directly. And for example, Monday's announcement of the Nobel Prize to Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Michael Kremer cited their path-breaking experimental work in development economics. But precisely because macroeconomics deals with the economy at its very broadest level, such experimental evidence is rarely available. For example, no responsible central bank is going to change interest rates sort of randomly just to help economists figure out the causal impact of monetary policy on output or employment. So macroeconomists are forced to try to establish causation in different ways. And a way that my co-author, and you will guess from the same last name, my husband, David Romer, and I have advocated is what we have called the narrative approach. And as Toke described, right, by the narrative approach, what we mean is an empirical technique where one gathers additional evidence from contemporary qualitative sources like policymakers' speeches or newspaper accounts or government reports and incorporates that systematically into the statistical analysis. And actually, our very first study in this vein looked at the effects of monetary policy. So it used records of the American Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, to identify times when the Fed changed monetary policy for reasons unrelated to current or prospective changes in output. In essence, times when the central bank ran experiments for us, perhaps by accident or perhaps because they were pursuing other goals. And what we found was that output and unemployment responded strongly and significantly to such exogenous policy actions, suggesting that changes in monetary policy do indeed cause changes in economic activity. So since that first paper, we've used the narrative approach to study other questions, such as the effects of tax changes on output or the effects of government transfer payments on consumption. And other scholars have used it to answer questions like what are the causal effects of banking panics on the real economy, or what's the impact of government austerity programs on economic activity. Well, 30 years have now passed since our very first paper using this technique. And so what I want to do is to use my lecture this afternoon to think critically about the narrative approach. So what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of the approach? What's required to make narrative work scientifically rigorous and replicable? And how does the narrative approach compare to other approaches? And you're going to see I'm going to talk broadly about the approach and the literature using it, but I'm going to focus most closely on the question that we asked way back in 1989, which is, does monetary policy matter? And one reason for this is that over the last year, David and I have revisited our original study. We've have used what we've learned over the last 30 years to see if we could do it better, right? And so I'll discuss some of the preliminary results on what we have found. I'll also discuss some ideas for making the narrative approach more valuable and easier to use for researchers. Now, I should say, as an aside, as I was walking through the library yesterday, I saw a poster for the Marshall Lecture last year, where Robert Shiller gave a lecture on narrative economics. And I thought maybe just so no one gets confused, I'll explain that what I'm talking about is quite different from what Shiller was talking about. So Shiller is interested in economic narratives or stories, but more as a way in thinking about how they might go viral, how they can be a source, if you wanted, the animal spirits that can affect economic activity. David and I use the term narrative approach differently, right? We use it to mean this empirical technique where you use narrative or qualitative sources in a systematic way to try to do better empirical work. So just so nobody's confused or wishing I were talking about something different. Okay, so that's sort of where we're headed. Let me start, sort of, I think a useful place to start is actually just to make clear why establishing causal relationships is hard in macroeconomics, but also incredibly important, and to talk broadly about how narrative evidence may be able to help. Now, in the case of monetary policy, it's probably pretty intuitive, right? So monetary policy, just so everyone's on the same page, can best be thought of as deliberate changes in interest rates by the central bank. And a variety of theories from old Keynesian to new Keynesian and beyond suggest that there's a negative relationship, that when interest rates rise, output and employment fall. And as a result, one's kind of first stab at considering the effects of monetary policy on economic activity might just be to look at the correlation between changes in interest rates and, say, changes in output. Do we see the hypothesized negative relationship? But it just takes a moment's reflection to realize that such an exercise is going to be deeply flawed. And because it's going to matter why the central bank is changing interest rates. And to see that, think back to 2007 or 2008. So central banks around the world were cutting interest rates like crazy as financial institutions like Northern Rock here in the UK or Lehman Brothers in the United States got into trouble. And even though output had not yet started to plummet, central banks could see the worrisome signs and were trying to counteract depressionary forces. All right? Well, in such cases, right, even if the theoretical relationship were correct, that there's a negative relationship between interest rate changes and output, you would hardly expect output to boom after the interest rate cuts in 2007 and 2008. Because there were other forces that were depressing output, really the best one could plausibly have hoped for from that particular interest rate cut might be that output would have held steady or not fall as much as it otherwise would have. So what I'm describing is an obvious case of what economists call omitted variable bias, right? If both monetary policy and output are being driven by some third factor, in this case, an incipient financial crisis, simple statistical tests will not recover the true causal relationship. The estimated effects will be biased, in the case of monetary policy, towards zero. And the easiest way to see that is to imagine that a substantial fraction of monetary changes are aimed at counteracting other forces that are affecting output and employment. if monetary policy has really powerful effects, right, and is conducted well, what you would see is interest rates moving around a lot and output just growing nice and steadily, right? And a computer confronted with that data would conclude, gee, there must not be much relationship between these two variables. And yet the premise of this example was there's a very strong true relationship. Well, that faulty conclusion that's going to come out of the empirical work could have very important policy implications. In particular, policymakers might misjudge the importance of their actions or think they don't have any power, or maybe they shouldn't be responding to things. All right, so omitted variable bias is just a ubiquitous problem in really all of economics, particularly, I think, in macroeconomics. Let me just give you two other kind of obvious examples. One has to do with the real effects of financial crises. So there's been lots of interest, not surprisingly, since the financial crisis, in this question of what do financial crises do to the rest of the economy? Do they cause high unemployment? Do they cause recessions, et cetera? And people have looked at various correlations between crises and recessions. Right? But you've got to realize that financial crises don't just come out of thin air, right? Something triggers them. And one of the things that can be a very important trigger is a severe recession, right? As unemployment goes up, people are unable to pay their debts, financial institutions become more fragile and prone to runs. Right? So in this case, we're really talking about a case of reverse causation rather than crises causing output changes. Maybe output changes cause crises. Well, reverse causation is really just a special case of omitted variable bias. And in this case, the bias would lead a naive statistician to, in fact, overestimate the causal relationship between financial crises and recessions, or perhaps see a relationship when there isn't really one in the data. Another example where this establishing causation is very hard has to do with the causal relationship between government austerity programs and the real economy. And by austerity programs, what I mean are deliberate reductions in government spending or increases in taxes to try to get a country's budget deficit down, right? And in fact, both before the 2008 crisis and especially after, there was a lot of interest among researchers and policymakers about the possibility of what's been called expansionary fiscal contraction, right? So one of the things Keynes taught us was that if the government were to, say, cut government spending, we'd expect that to lower aggregate demand, cause output to fall. But there's a school of researchers that said no, sort of contrary to that usual theory, perhaps a government getting its budget deficit down, getting its fiscal house in order, could actually be so good for the economy, for confidence, we might actually see output going up. And indeed, there's some researchers looking across countries seem to find that periods of substantial decreases in cyclically adjusted budget deficits across countries seem to be correlated with increases in output in a number of countries, right? But just as with monetary policy, it's really important to ask the question of why were budget deficits falling? So, for example, a stock market boom, it can increase even cyclically adjusted tax revenues and so reduce the budget deficit, right? But a stock market boom can also be telling you that firms in the economy are coming up with great new discoveries, and so output's in fact going to rise in the future. Right? And as a result, right, there's a positive correlation between falling cyclically adjusted deficits and increased output could just be the result of omitted variable bias, not a true causal relationship. Well, given the prevalence of omitted variable bias in macroeconomic relationships, empirical researchers have to find a way to deal with it. And one way is bringing in narrative evidence. So there's often a great deal of information that isn't captured by sort of numbers, right? That it's contained in contemporary documents about, say, why policy actions were taken or what was causing something like a financial crisis to happen. And this additional information, if we can find a way to harvest it and use it, can help us to tease out the true causal relationship. Right? And in the example of monetary policy, which is going to be the main case I talk about today, central banks often keep detailed records of why they took various policy actions. In the United States, we in fact have the verbatim transcripts of what was said at the meetings of monetary policymakers. Right? And the idea of the narrative approach is that one can use these records to try to separate monetary policy moves that were taken, say, in response to what was happening in the economy, perhaps in response to anticipations of a recession that might be around the corner, and separate those from monetary actions taken for more exogenous reasons, or reasons not related to current or expected output. And I'll discuss in a bit just how one might do this, confronted with the record. But once you have this separation, once you have a subset of monetary changes that you're pretty sure are not being caused by some omitted variable, what you can do is then look at the behavior of output or unemployment or whatever you're interested in after these relatively exogenous changes. And those estimates should give you a sense of the true causal impact of monetary policy. They should be much less affected by omitted variable bias. And actually later in the talk, I'll also talk about two studies that actually looked that used the narrative approach to think about, say, the real effects of financial crises or the impact of austerity programs. Okay, so that's kind of the big picture motivation. What I want to do now is to turn to discussing sort of more specifically how one does the narrative approach, if you want, and especially what I think is involved in doing it well. And there are really two steps in this type of research. So the first is going to be the analysis of the narrative source, right, to gather that additional qualitative evidence. And then the second is to incorporate the additional evidence into a statistical framework so you can do conventional hypothesis testing. Of the two steps, the first one is certainly the more difficult, right? And actually many years ago, Tom Sargent was discussing one of our papers, and he referred to what we do as the literary approach. And I'm pretty sure he did not mean it as a compliment. And his tone was very much that narrative work was inherently somehow less scientific and less rigorous than conventional data analysis. And I think David and I could not disagree with that view more strongly. I think anyone who has done an empirical study knows that there are hundreds of judgment calls that an empirical researcher has to make. And if you're looking more broadly at the profession, right, though economists are taking steps to improve, the current record on the reproducibility of empirical results is currently truly appalling. So I believe that narrative evidence can be both rigorous and reproducible. And so I'm going to try to describe what I think are the key steps that we need to take to do good narrative analysis. And as I said, as I go along, I'll be describing the new narrative research that David and I have been doing on the effects of monetary policy, always kind of with an eye to evaluating how well are we doing the narrative work. All right, so what's involved with good narrative work? So I think the first sort of fundamental determinant of the quality of your narrative analysis is how good is your source, right? So what's a good source that we can use to get this additional information? So one is that it needs to be contemporary or real time with the thing you're trying to measure. And the reason for that is one worries that if it isn't contemporaneous with, say, the policy decisions being made, subsequent economic outcomes may affect how people describe what happened or the motivation for what happened. Right? Another thing, the narrative source should exist for a long period of time and be reasonably consistent, right? Otherwise, you won't be getting the same information over time. And perhaps the most difficult, the source has to be accurate, right? So a long, real-time, consistently wrong source is really not going to do you much good. So what one's looking for is a source that reliably reports, say, what was said at a meeting or the observations of knowledgeable, relatively unbiased observers. Right? For the study that we're currently doing, the narrative source that we're using, as I described, are the detailed minutes and transcripts of the policy-making meetings of the American Federal Reserve, our central bank. And these are either very detailed summaries of the discussion with lots of paraphrases of what people said, or they're verbatim transcripts. And they're absolutely contemporary or with the monetary policy decisions. They're roughly 50 to 100 pages of transcripts or minutes per meeting. So if you do the math, there in the US, there's typically kind of 8 to 12 of these policy-making meetings per year, in some periods even more. So we're talking about a lot of information and a lot of reading. And one particular virtue about this source, and it goes to this question of accuracy, is that at least for most of the period that we're looking at, the source was expected to be confidential, which is it was never supposed to see the light of day. So from our perspective, that's great because it suggests that the policymakers should not have been talking carefully or guardedly, but rather should have felt free to be actually stating their forthright opinions. Right? So for all these reasons, we think this is a particularly good source. Right? So that's I think that's an important thing. Now, one thing to say, this is different than the source we used for our very early study on this topic. So back in 1989, we couldn't bear to think about reading the thousands of pages that we've read for what I'll be talking about today. So we used the shorter, the publicly released statements that the Fed had made about their reasoning for doing things. And those are inherently briefer, so we think the more detailed records are likely to give us more information. Moreover, those record of policy actions were always meant to be publicly available. And so we suspect that they may therefore be somewhat less forthright. So we think it's a useful thing to come back and look at the same question, but with a different and we think better narrative source. Okay, so one requirement for good narrative work, you need a good source. A second requirement, just as important as having a good source, is how do you approach it, right? And you need to have a clear idea of what one's looking for in the documents. That's really where, if you want, the creativity lies, right? What can we learn from the narrative source that would aid us in establishing causation? And this is what made Friedman and Schwartz's classic, A Monetary History of the U.S., so important. Right? They were if you want, the true parents of the narrative approach, at least in the context of monetary policy. And their genius was knowing what to look for in the diaries of early central bankers or early records of the Federal Reserve. that could help them establish causation. And I like to think that David and I and other scholars, modern researchers, have taken Friedman and Schwartz's insights and improved and expanded on them. But our intellectual debt to them is enormous. Right? So to do the narrative analysis rigorously, one needs to approach the qualitative source. You need to know what you're looking for, and you need to approach it honestly and consistently. So, and there are various things that are involved with that. So the more concrete the criteria you can set down for how you're going to code what you read in a narrative source that you're going to use in your empirical analysis, then that's going to make what you do more rigorous and more reproducible. And importantly, one has to read the entire source from beginning to end. Exactly one way you can go wrong is if you say, oh, I know the interesting stuff happened in 1979, so I'm really going to look at that part of the records, and I'm not going to read the others. You need to read the source consistently. You also have to be honest, that is, and you have to resist the temptation to see what you want to see in the narrative record. And in this, David and I are big fans of having multiple researchers. We find that we keep each other honest. We also find that writing very detailed descriptions of our analysis of various episodes is just a crucial part of the narrative work. The documentation process both clarifies our own thinking and it makes it easier for subsequent researchers to check our work. And one change that we've absolutely noticed in our own narrative work over time is that the narrative appendices are getting longer and longer. In fact, in our original study on monetary policy, there was no appendix. It was just 20 pages in the text of the article. To give you a sense, for the recent project that we've been doing on the aftermath of financial crises, there are 3 narrative appendices, and together they are about 300 single-spaced pages. So as we've gotten better at this, our standards for how you document what you do have definitely gone up. All right, well, to make sort of these general principles sort of more concrete, let me describe what we look for in the Fed transcripts. All right, so at a broad level, right, what we're going to be looking for are times when policymakers moved interest rates for reasons having nothing to do with current or prospective economic activity. So in those cases, the behavior of output or unemployment following such episodes should give us less or ideally unbiased estimates of the true causal impact of monetary policy. The problem with this very broad framing is really kind of the framing that Friedman and Schwartz used in their work, is that it's very hard to specify kind of concrete criteria that you're going to use that could be used to describe sort of what you're looking for in the record. So we instead are going to look for something more specific and somewhat narrower in the narrative record. Right? So in particular, as in our original paper, what we're going to look for are times when monetary policymakers felt that the economy was essentially at potential or normal output. It was not having any tendency to move away from there. But policymakers basically woke up one morning and said, we don't like the current prevailing rate of inflation. And in particular, we don't like it so much that we are going to raise interest rates, realizing that there would be, or at least could be, adverse consequences for output and unemployment. So if you want to think in terms of a standard aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework, we're looking for times when the Federal Reserve deliberately shifted back the aggregate demand curve because they wanted to get inflation down. And so these are going to be episodes where if monetary policy has real effects, you'd expect to see output go down. So these are going to be contractionary monetary policy shocks. Now, an important extension, that was all we did in our original paper. An important extension that we do in the new work is to actually try to broaden our criteria to say, can we use sort of the same kind of framework to think about positive or expansionary monetary policy shocks as well? Right? So for an expansionary shock, what we're going to be looking for are, again, times when the central bank thought that it was roughly at potential output. They weren't seeing signs that output was planning to deviate from that. But they decided that they really wanted the unemployment rate to be lower. So they reduce interest rates, understanding that that could well have adverse consequences for inflation, would tend to push inflation up. Right? So if monetary policy has a true causal impact, we would expect after these episodes where policymakers basically changed their tastes and wanted less unemployment, you'd expect to see output going up, unemployment going down, and inflation going up. Right? So those are what we're looking for in the narrative sources, the times when that fit these descriptions. Now, the process involved of reading and all of that can't really kind of show you that, but let me show you what at least two examples of things that we classify as a contractionary or an expansionary shock and give you a little bit of a feel of what we read in the narrative source that makes us say, yes, that fits our definition. All right, so one, let me start with the contractionary shock. So December of 1988 is a time in the US when we think we see one of these negative monetary policy shocks. So at the time, certainly the Fed staff was telling policymakers, you're basically at full employment. There was, however, much dissatisfaction about where current inflation was. It was at about 4.5%. And you see just a little bit of this. So this is what one member said. Overall, I think the costs of allowing inflation to become embedded are very high. I'd skew policy and take the risk on the side of being overly tight. And that's kind of representative. A lot of people are just saying, I don't like where inflation currently is. And then policymakers agreed to tighten policy, and the idea being to get inflation down. And importantly, they made it clear that they realized that a price might well have to be paid in terms of unemployment. Right? So for example, here's another quote. I think the job before us is to contain the inflation and to slow this economy down. Right? So that is a sort of an essence of, we think we're trying to shift back the aggregate demand curve. All right, let me give you an example that we find of an expansionary monetary policy shock. So this we go back to January of 1972 in the US. So actually the unemployment rate was already quite low. There was no sense that the economy was facing a recession or any other forces that were going to be pushing us in that direction. But Arthur Burns, who was the Fed chair at the time, pushed very hard to nevertheless have monetary expansion. And the whole episode is actually quite dramatic. It has sort of an expansionary sort of complement to what we often think of as the Volcker disinflation. So Burns called a special meeting of the policymaking committee, and he presented his plan. He says we need to have more expansionary policy. And his argument, this was back at a time when they were focusing more strongly not on interest rates but on the money supply. And his argument was that the Fed was not hitting its money targets, and so it was not doing its part to be lowering unemployment, and to be supporting the policies that the president and the Congress wanted, which was to lower unemployment. And you see that he said he was fearful about the future of the economy if we didn't get our aggregates to grow more quickly, our monetary aggregates. He'd feel that there might be some validity in a charge that the system was not supporting the policies of the administration and Congress. Right? And what's really interesting is member after member go along and say, you realize if you do this, we're going to cause inflation. And in fact, so just as an example, one member kind of gingerly says, the committee should perhaps consider whether stimulating the economy to greater heights might not involve a cost in terms of resurgent inflationary pressures. Remarkably, though, everybody goes along, and they do the expansionary policy, right? So we think of this as an example of an expansionary shock. For reasons unrelated to what they think is going to be happening in the economy, they decide they just want to get unemployment lower. They're shifting out that aggregate demand curve, and if monetary policy has causal impacts, we should see output rise. Okay, so what comes out of a year of our life, which is what it took us to read all of these transcripts and things, are dates of monetary policy shocks. We find 12 months in the period, and I should warn you, we didn't get finished, so we stop in 2000. So we're not going to be telling you anything about very current monetary policy. But we look at the period 1947 through 2000. We find 12 times that fit our definition of a monetary policy shock. 8 that are contractionary, times when the Fed said, we don't like the current rate of inflation and we're willing to accept a recession to get it down. And 4 expansionary shocks, times when they say, we don't like the current rate of unemployment and we're willing to accept inflation to get it down. Right? Now, remember that part of the motivation, and I should say, these are preliminary, so don't hold us to this because we've done the reading, we've done the family discussion across the dining room table and decided that these were the dates. But what we haven't done is what I described is a really important part of the process, which is writing the infinitely long appendices where you give your reasoning for why, what was it that we read in each case that made us classify things this way. And that process does sometimes change our thinking. So you should think of these as preliminary. Now, one of the things that I mentioned, that the reason we came back to this is to see it's in some sense as a check on our younger selves, and also as on what was a more limited narrative source. So we think we're better at this now. We think we have a better source. So how did it change things? Now, for the most part, it turns out we were pretty good back in the olden days. So we decided that the 7 monetary shocks that we had identified in that early research, really, we got those right. They do fit this definition. The better, more detailed source kind of caused us to move the dates a month or two in some cases. We found one case where we missed something. So September of 1958 is a time in the minutes, it just stands out. They say, we don't like the current rate of inflation, we're going to tighten. We understand that that may have adverse consequences. Interestingly, even knowing that it's there in the minutes, when we go back and it's like, did we miss something the first time? It's just not there in the simpler, more limited source that we were looking at back in 1989. The thing that so we certainly add one contractionary shock. The other thing that we add, we do find 4 times that we think fit our definition of an expansionary monetary policy shock. So that's going to give us some additional information. We can now look at some different questions because we have not just contractionary shocks, but also some expansionary ones. Okay, so that's the sort of how we think you do narrative well, trying to give you a sense of how we did it and what came out of it. Right. So far, if you want, I've described part one of the narrative approach. It's taking your qualitative source, things that are just words, and reading them systematically, consistently with a set of criteria to say, all right, when is there evidence of that we can use to tease out causation? So in this case, when are there times when the Fed is changing things not in response to what it sees happening in the economy, right? The next step is to not just stop there, don't just tell stories, but to take that qualitative information and bring it into a statistical framework so that we can use the tools of econometric statistics, hypothesis testing, to actually then take that narrative evidence and say, what does it tell us, right? And this narrative evidence, how you incorporate what is sort of qualitative information into a statistical framework, well, there are a variety of ways. The simplest is to just translate the narrative information into an indicator or a dummy variable. And that's what we're going to do in what I described today. So if you think about our monetary policy shocks, there are 12 times when the Fed made these decisions. We're going to just set up a dummy variable that is +1 in the 8 times when there was a contractionary monetary shock. It's going to be -1 in the 4 months when there was an expansionary shock, otherwise 0. And if you want to understand or just figure out what's the sign convention, think about it as about what's happening to interest rates. The Fed raises interest rates with contractionary shocks. They cut them with expansionary shocks. So that's why we made expansions the -1. Now, you could be more sophisticated about this. You could imagine scaling your dummy variable. Maybe in our case, you could imagine scaling it by how much did the Fed change interest rates, something like that. And we've certainly used that approach in other studies, right? That gives you a way of saying not just when there were shocks, but how big were they. And then one easy way to then just incorporate the narrative evidence into a statistical framework is just run a very simple reduced form regression. Just regress something you care about, like what happens to output on when there were monetary shocks, right? And that's going to be primarily what we do today. Now, there's another alternative that is probably going through a lot of the researchers' heads in the room, which is this almost just cries out for an instrumental variables approach, right? So what you could imagine is rather than just running a reduced form of changes in output on monetary shocks, you could regress changes in output on changes in interest rates, instrumenting for interest rates with our monetary policy shocks. And that would allow the computer to estimate how interest rates respond to the shocks and only use the component of interest rate movements related to monetary policy shocks to estimate the relationship between output and interest rates. It actually turns out to be pretty tricky to use an instrumental variables approach in this case, mainly because macroeconomic relationships inherently have a lot of serial correlation. So when you're estimating, say, the impact of interest rates on output, you need to have a lot of lags of interest rates to capture the relationship. And figuring out how to use sort of contemporaneous and lagged values of your shock series as an instrument for all of the contemporaneous and lagged values of interest rates is just remarkably complicated, but it's certainly possible. But for today, we're just going to talk about a reduced form. Okay, so specifically, what do I mean by the reduced form, or how are we going to take this qualitative evidence and put it into a statistical framework? We're going to use the Jordan local projection method. The main variable I'm going to look at today is just the unemployment rate. So we've done everything also for real GDP. In future work, we want to look at inflation, exchange rates, all sorts of things. But for today, we're just going to say, do monetary policy shocks affect something we really care about, which is kind of the state of the economy, the unemployment rate. So as I said, we're going to do the Jordan local projection, and if you're not familiar with it, it's just a very intuitive sort of non-parametric way to estimate an impulse response function. So the idea is you're going to regress unemployment at various horizons after time t on your monetary shock variable at t. Right? So there's the equation. So U is the unemployment rate. S is our shock variable. And that's the shock variable. It's that dummy variable, +1 if it's a contractionary shock, -1 if it's an expansionary shock, and 0 otherwise. We're going to put in a constant term. And then what we're going to do is estimate this equation, if you want, for every horizon from period 0 up through 60 months ahead, or 5 years. So the idea is you regress unemployment at time t on shock at time t, unemployment at t+1 on the shock at t, unemployment at t+2 on the shock at t. And the sequence of those beta coefficients is the impulse response function. All right, so that's the basic idea. Here's what, before I show you what comes out, think about what sign you're going to be expecting. So the impulse response function will say, well, what's an innovation of 1 in our shock series? Well, 1 is a contractionary monetary policy shock. So what you'd be looking for, if conventional theory is right, is we would expect to see the unemployment rate going up. Right? And that's just what you see. So this is the impulse response function for unemployment to a monetary policy shock. And what you're supposed to see is the unemployment rate rises. It starts slowly, so kind of get your bearing here. This is 5 years. So not much happens initially. Then it gradually goes up. The peak effect occurs about 3 years after the monetary shock. The peak effect is just our unscaled monetary shock dummy is a rise in the unemployment rate of 1.6 percentage points. And that's a big rise, right? That's like going from a 5% unemployment rate to 6.6. Right? And then what you see is it gradually comes back down. And so by the time you get out to 5 years, the effect is down to about 0.4 percentage point, and it's no longer statistically significant. And I didn't say it, but I realize I'm sitting here going, I'm drawing on my computer screen, and you can't see it. Anyway, so the dashed lines are the 2 standard error bands. And so you can see the effects are highly statistically significant. If you want to know just how statistically significant, these estimates are like t-stats of 6. So certainly very large. All right. One thing, so I said, right, this is in some ways replicating, extending an early study. One thing we can do is compare our results to what we got back in 1989. They're a little bit different, but I think maybe the most interesting thing is now that we have what we think is a better measure of shocks, it includes some additional shocks, it includes some positive shocks as well as negative. The results are qualitatively similar in that in both cases, a contractionary shock raises the unemployment rate. The effect is smaller, as we have with our new estimates, but it's more precisely estimated. Not surprising, we have 12 observations of monetary shocks rather than just 7. Right? So, but that gives you a little bit of a sense. Something else that we can do that we couldn't do in our original study because we didn't have any, we hadn't been looking for expansionary shocks, we can, in fact, now ask, well, do positive and negative monetary shocks have similar effects, right? And so for the way that we had defined it before, where we just had one dummy variable, you put the contractionary shocks as a 1, the expansionary shocks as a -1, that forces the computer to have the same impacts for the two types of shocks. Right? What we can do, though, is, well, let's enter the two separately. So have one dummy variable for contractionary shocks, another for expansionary shocks. And just to kind of, so the signs are sort of as you'd expect, in each case, we're just going to have, it's just going to be a 1 if you have a shock. So you'd expect after a contractionary shock, the unemployment rate to go up. After an expansionary shock, you'd expect the unemployment rate to go down. And that is exactly what you find. So contractionary shocks push up the unemployment rate, expansionary lower them. However, what you're going to notice is that the rise in unemployment following a contractionary shock is about twice as large as the fall in unemployment after an expansionary shock. And that is, if you want, contractionary shocks are more contractionary than expansionary shocks are expansionary. And the effects of expansionary shocks seem to wane more quickly. The difference is also statistically significant, so it does seem to suggest that there may genuinely be some asymmetry in the effect of positive and negative shocks, and that's certainly going to be something that we want to be thinking about, where that might be coming from, how to understand it. But at the very least, we think it suggests it was useful to expand the narrative research to include expansionary shocks. Something else that we're able to do is to think about not only what's the impact of a monetary shock on unemployment, but to actually get a sense of how important have monetary shocks been to sort of the overall behavior of the economy, right? And in some ways, the simplest way to do this is to just look at the unemployment rate and the dates of our monetary policy shocks. So that's what I show you here. The blue line is just American unemployment data for the period we're looking at, 47, or I guess 48 through 2000. And then those red lines are the months where we identify a contractionary monetary policy shock. And what you're supposed to see that in this picture, there are 9 times in that period when unemployment goes up and the NBER identifies a recession. In 7 of those 9 recessions, there is also a contractionary monetary policy shock preceded it. And the lag is on average about 18 months. There's actually an 8th recession. It is in 1973, which I'm not even going to try to point to, where there's a monetary policy shock, but it occurs three months after the recession has started. What I want you to take from this at a very crude level, it suggests that monetary policy shocks were probably a pretty important source of recessions in at least the first 5 decades of the post-World War II period in the US. Now, we can actually do a slightly more sophisticated calculation, which is to say, kind of bring in what we get from the impulse response function and say just sort of, well, what fraction of these cyclical increases in unemployment might our monetary policy shock be explaining? And so we just do, again, a kind of simple calculation. We start with the fact 7 out of the 9 recessions in the pre-2001 period were preceded by a contractionary monetary policy shock. Our impulse response function, so in those 9 recessions, unemployment on average went up 2.8 percentage points. Our impulse response function says somewhere between 1.1 and 1.7 percentage points is accounted for by our monetary policy shock. So if you want to say sort of how important quantitatively have monetary shocks been, we get a number sort of between, we can explain kind of between 31% and 47%. So as much as half of US downturns before 2001 can be explained by monetary shocks. You can also do the same kind of analysis for thinking about expansionary shocks. So this is a picture we're going to show you. This is the unemployment rate minus our best estimate of the natural rate or the normal rate of unemployment. And what you're going to see is there are 7 times where this number is negative, which means the unemployment rate is below the natural rate. And then I've drawn in lines at the dates of our expansionary monetary policy shock. And you can see that 4 of those 7 periods when unemployment is below the natural rate for a sustained period are preceded by these expansionary monetary policy shocks. And if you go further and actually try to, again, use the impulse response function, you find that more than half of that, in those cases, of the fall in unemployment can be explained by monetary policy shocks. Okay, so that's kind of a saying, when you do the narrative work, what comes out of it? There are big impacts, big causal impacts of monetary policy shocks on the economy, and they in fact appear to account for a large fraction of US cyclical fluctuations. Okay, so now I've shown you a lot about the narrative approach and how you could use that. The natural thing to do is to say, well, let's compare it with other ways people have tried to estimate the impact of monetary policy to get a sense of, did all of this work have a purpose, right? Did it change how you think about things? All right, so the main alternative approach to estimating the effects of monetary policy are often purely statistical. So specifically, vector autoregression. So at the simplest level, a VAR is just a system of variables, say interest rates, output, prices, and each variable is assumed to depend on lags of itself and on the contemporaneous and lagged values of other variables. And identification is typically achieved just through timing assumptions. So for example, in a conventional VAR, interest rates are assumed to respond to output contemporaneously, but output's only allowed to respond to interest rates with a lag, right? And you surely know that vector autoregressions have been a very influential and widely used technique. Now, there are a number of papers criticizing VARs, but, and this is not the place to sort of recount all of the arguments, but I think the fundamental point is that timing assumptions are not enough to deal with the identification problem. Saying that interest rates can respond contemporaneously to output, but output only responds to interest rates with a lag, doesn't deal with forward-looking policy. And if you think about modern central banks, they invest just infinite resources in trying to forecast where the economy is headed. And they spend a lot of time moving interest rates in anticipation of future movements in output inflation. And forward-looking policy means that there is still omitted variable bias in a conventional VAR, and none of the more sophisticated versions get around this fundamental problem. Well, given this fact, it's not surprising that VARs typically find decidedly smaller impacts of monetary policy than we find using the narrative approach. Right? They also find surprising things like prices go the wrong direction. After a contractionary monetary shock, prices seem to rise, the so-called price puzzle. This is exactly what you'd expect if monetary policy was responding to anticipations of inflation and the empirical technique didn't take account of forward-looking policy. Related to this finding of smaller effects, VAR methods also tend to find a much smaller role for monetary policy in explaining overall fluctuation. So for example, one of the best papers in the VAR literature by Bernanke, Boivin, and Elias finds that monetary policy shocks account for at most 10% of the variation in real GDP, which is a lot less than we're finding using the narrative approach. Right? So we think the fact that the narrative approach, which tries to deal seriously with the omitted variable problem inherent in VARs, reaches such a different conclusion is a sign that it matters a great deal. And arguably it changes the way we view monetary policy, and especially just how important monetary policy is as a source of fluctuations. All right, a second approach to estimating the effects of monetary policy is actually one that David and I have also done. And that is, it involves taking residuals from a reaction function. And we like to think of this as kind of a mixture of both statistical and narrative approaches. So the idea is to use the forecasts of inflation and output and unemployment that are produced by the staff of the Federal Reserve before every meeting of the policymaking committee. And we're going to use narrative evidence to try to identify what was the Fed trying to do to the policy interest rate, and to convince ourselves, and we hope our readers, that the staff forecast sort of captures the information that the Fed has about future economic developments. And then the basic idea is to estimate a monetary policy reaction function based on those forecasts. And that is, we're going to estimate how the Fed moves the intended funds rate in response to the forecasts of future developments, and then take the residuals from this prediction equation as our measure of monetary shocks. And the idea is that by regressing their intentions for the funds rate on their information about future economic developments, the residuals show interest rate movements uncorrelated with those forecasts of future output movements. And then what we do is to just incorporate that new measure of monetary shocks into a vector autoregression. And to see how the new shock series matters, we also run a more conventional VAR that just uses the actual funds rate as the monetary policy variable. And then, so this slide shows you what came out of that way of estimating monetary policy shocks. And what you see is that we find substantially larger effects of monetary policy using what we think, oh, here I do it again, using what we think are better estimates of monetary shocks than you would get from a conventional VAR just using the actual funds rate and timing assumptions. And though you don't see the standard errors there, the effects are much more precisely estimated. Now, not surprisingly, we think this is also a very good way to estimate monetary policy shocks and get the true causal impact of monetary policy. And it does, we think, address the problem of forward-looking policy, and so deals with omitted variable bias. A benefit that it has relative to the work I've been describing today is it's not purely narrative, right? It uses the Fed's own forecasts, but it's a highly statistical approach. And one effect of that is others have been able to replicate us or extend us fairly easily. But let me make the case that even this approach, which we think is pretty good, has some disadvantages. So one of the biggest is that the Fed's own forecasts don't exist until the late 1960s. So it's not an approach that you can use for more historical analysis. Also, other central banks in different countries either don't have official forecasts until much later, or perhaps not at all, and so the approach is somewhat less generally applicable. Just to also point out, another possible problem, even in the American case, is that we only have staff forecasts before regularly scheduled meetings, and some of the most sort of dramatic policy changes occur at emergency meetings, and so you're not going to miss you're going to miss those shocks using this approach, right? So, but it's one of the things that perhaps is really important. We get quite comparable results from this approach and from the purely narrative work that we were describing earlier. The third sort of method that's certainly very much in vogue today on trying to estimate the impacts of monetary policy is what's called sort of high-frequency identification, right? And the idea is the following. So researchers use data from futures markets to see what market participants were expecting the policy interest rate to be, and then they look at changes in those futures rates in a small window around central bank announcements. So for example, they might look at the change in the federal funds rate within a half an hour of the Fed's policy announcement. And if the window's small enough, right, it's unlikely that other news about the economy just happens to come out in the same window. So this technique picks up movements in the policy interest rate that market participants weren't expecting given their available information. And one of the first papers using this technique is the one I have cited here by Cochrane and Piazzesi back from 2002. So they're going to get these monetary shocks using this high-frequency kind of identification. And then they're just going to run a very Jordan-like procedure. They're going to guess employment at various horizons after time t on these monetary shocks. And what they find is it's statistically insignificant, but they actually find for a contractionary monetary shock that the unemployment rate, or that the employment actually goes up. So the sign is wrong, right? Which it's certainly not what standard theories predict. I think it's really important to realize that the shocks that are identified by this high frequency identification are fundamentally different from what David and I have been talking about in either of our old work or the work I was just describing. The high frequency shocks are monetary policy surprises. They are actions by the central bank that caught market participants off guard. If the central bank signals that it's planning to take action, that doesn't show up as a shock, even if the central bank is making a big change in policy that has nothing to do, say, with future economic developments. And because modern central banks do tend to telegraph or at least hint very strongly at their intended actions, genuine monetary surprises are typically very small, right? Even when they're quite dramatic changes in policy. I think that may be why the high-frequency approach finds little effects of monetary policy on output. There just isn't much useful information in the shock series. So while this high-frequency identification is, I think, really promising in some applications, I think it's probably not a reliable way to estimate the causal impact of monetary policy on GDP or other aggregate variables. So I guess what I'd like you to take away from this comparison with the other approaches is that we think there are some really important benefits to using the narrative approach to estimate the causal impact of monetary policy. Okay, so far I've talked in general about how to do the narrative approach and how it could be useful. We've discussed in depth our own work on applying the narrative approach to the case of monetary policy. The last thing I want to do is to discuss some other applications of the narrative approach, those that have already been done or something that I think is just waiting to yet be done. And then I want to conclude by thinking about ways to make the narrative approach easier to use and more reproducible. All right, so first, just some existing studies. So I started earlier, I mentioned two other questions where establishing causation is difficult. So the effects of financial crises and the impact of austerity. Let me show you just two studies that have used the narrative approach to try to answer that question. So the one is by Andrew Jalil on the effects of financial crises on output. And what Andy did was to realize that, right, today it's really hard to find anything that we would call an exogenous financial panic, right? That means, so one not related to, say, what's going on in the economy, that modern panics are just so multifaceted and caused by all sorts of domestic and international forces. But if you go further back in history, when the financial system was simpler, it is possible to identify idiosyncratic causes of panics. And that's what Jalil did. He went back and his narrative source was sort of the premier financial newspaper of the time for the 19th and early 20th century US. And what he did was to read it and identify when panics occurred, and more importantly, could he find a subset of panics where it was pretty clear there weren't they weren't being caused by movements in output. And indeed, what he found is a handful of panics that seemed to be caused by quite idiosyncratic factors, like, a suspicious suicide among a bank executive or an embezzlement scandal or something like that. And then what he did is to look at just, well, how did output behave after those relatively exogenous panics? And this is what comes out. So this is just showing the response of industrial production to an exogenous financial panic. And what you see is the effects are big, they're negative. When you have a panic, it's hard on your economy, and they're highly statistically significant. And I think this is a study, if you want to know why I think financial panics have real effects, it's this kind of evidence that I think really convinced me of this. The second question that I mentioned was the causal impact of fiscal austerity. So this question of whether austerity can be, so good for confidence that in fact raises output. And the study is by researchers at the IMF, and what they did was to go through for lots of countries all of their sort of legislative and budget documents, and actually to try to identify when were countries actually deliberately trying to get their budget deficit down. So not sort of these accidental declines that might have been caused by other factors also moving output. And so they used the narrative approach to identify deliberate fiscal consolidations or austerity packages, and then they looked at what happened to output. And sure enough, what they find is what Keynes would have told us, which is if you reduce your budget deficit, it is going to have negative consequences for the economy. So the blue line shows you what happens to output. It does indeed fall. Fiscal contractions are contractionary, not expansionary, and the red line shows you that unemployment goes up. Right? So those are just two examples of studies using the narrative approach that I think really got us some important answers to important questions. All right, how about some places where it hasn't been used, but I think it could still be used? Right? And there are lots of them, but two that occur to me. One has to do with institutions and economic growth, right? Economists strongly suspect that institutions like free trade, strong property rights, universal education may be very helpful for economic growth. But establishing that causal relationship has proved very difficult. And the problem is, again, one of omitted variable bias, right? Why countries have certain institutions may be influenced by factors that affect growth directly. So one idea, I think, that you could use the narrative approach, you could look at founding documents or the legislative history of certain institutions, where we could perhaps identify institutions that developed for fairly idiosyncratic or relatively exogenous reasons. And these cases could be used to test the causal impact of institutions on growth. A related area might have to do with financial structure or regulation on financial stability, right? Because there's a lot of variation, say, in financial regulation across countries, but you have to wonder, are those differences because they have different experiences in financial stability or for more exogenous reasons? And so it seems to me this is a classic case where, again, you could use the narrative record. There's a lot of information about why countries have certain financial regulations or certain structures to their financial system. And that you might be able to find some regulatory changes that reflect values or political concerns rather than a response to current or prospective financial distress. And so you could use those handful of observations to see how regulation may affect financial stability. So these are just some examples, but I think there are actually a host of others. So I think it is a valuable approach that is widely applicable. All right, well, if I've convinced you of that the narrative approach done well has some important strengths, it seems like the obvious last question is there a way to make it easier to use? And that could be both, could you make it more scientific and rigorous and just not as time consuming? Because certainly in the form that David and I do it, it goes beyond time consuming to perhaps one could say tedious, right? So the question is, could you delegate this to research, so other humans, so research assistants, or computers? And I think both of those, you can kind of lump them together because many of the same issues arise. Not that I'm, sorry guys, not that humans are, anyway, you know what I mean. And I'm going to say that I think the answer is a qualified yes, by which I mean, I think at some point, in some cases, if you do it really carefully. So what am I thinking? Or sort of what are some of the challenges to, well, here, I'll come back to that. So I think one question, sort of, when are you likely to be able to delegate the kind of narrative work that we've been talking about to maybe an untrained other human being or to a computer? And I think one consideration is just how complicated is the narrative work you're trying to do. So it's going to inherently, if you're just trying to look at the transcripts of Fed minutes, were they positive or negative? Sort of what's the state of the discussion? That's going to be something that's much easier to delegate or mechanize than a more subtle thing like, were they responding to the state of the economy or not, right? Now, having said that, I think even with straightforward tasks, it seems like sort of delegating things to research assistants or computers may leave something to be desired. So this is, I think, getting back to the study that Toke was discussing, which is Alain Neff, who got his PhD here at Cambridge with a grant from the Keynes Fund, no less. But he has a very nice paper where he's looking at the impact of exchange rate interventions using narrative records on why the interventions were done. And one thing that I particularly like about the paper is he shows you three different ways of doing the narrative coding. So one is he does it himself, so that's the author score. Another way is he uses basically untrained humans using Amazon's Mechanical Turk resource. And the third is to use a computer algorithm. And so this table is showing you the correlation between the different things. And what you notice is that untrained humans are, all right, so that is this center. So it's kind of has a correlation with Neff's own reading of sort of 0.4 to 0.7. That's okay, it's not great. The computer algorithm is really quite wretched, right? Sort of between 0.1 and 0.2 correlation with his reading. So that certainly gives you a sense it's not trivial to mechanize or delegate this out. And I think it's also important to realize that what he's trying to get, what the information he's trying to get from the narrative analysis is not particularly difficult or complex. I think obviously the quality of the computer algorithm is going to matter a lot. Sort of as we've digitized so many of our government records, I can't tell you how many seminars I go to where there are word clouds and things, people trying to use computer algorithms. I think one of the things that so far I think they've been somewhat disappointing. I think it's most likely, even though the techniques are really hard, they're still somewhat crude relative to the questions that we're trying to answer. And that kind of goes back to the research I was showing you before, that the algorithm does, even a really good complicated algorithm does quite poorly relative to even an untrained human. All right. If I were to think about where do we go from here, or where's there the most hope, it's going to have to be with genuine machine learning, right? So it's going to have to, I think what's going to be crucial, that training is going to be essential, that the only way you could ever actually take narrative work and truly mechanize it is the humans are going to have to do some of it, right? So look at the source, figure out what you can get, do enough sort of observations, and train a computer based on that. If you think that way, then it makes you realize there are going to be some times when that's not going to be very easy. So if you only have a few observations, so the idea that we're going to train a computer to do what we've done when we've found 12 shocks in 50 years, I think it's going to be really hard to do that. I think the other thing that's going to be hard is, again, for these kind of subtle things, I suspect that the computational kind of demands are just going to be too large. So where does kind of all this leave us? I'm still hopeful that computers could do a lot of this research, but I think for now, I suspect that good narrative research is still going to be done the old-fashioned way that I've been scribing today, which is scholars sitting at their desk or their dining room table reading for hours on end. Or maybe to put it in more personal terms, so David and I thoroughly expect to be made redundant by computers eventually, but we're hoping we don't expect it to be for a few years yet to come. So with that, let me stop and say thank you.
So I have a question on identifying multi-show emerging country by narrative approach. So it is a bit technical. So the paper, when you measure monetary policy in 2004, I read it before, and identified like US monetary shock by narrative approach, right? And the implicit assumption in that paper is that like the US can implement independent monetary policy. But in the emerging country, that is not the case. Like central bank takes like exchange rate into account, and monetary policy is not independent. So my question is like, how shall I like deal with exchange rate if I want to identify monetary shock in emerging country in the regression? That's the first question. And the second question is like, what if so in your 2004 paper, so what if market expectation is different from the central bank expectation? So what if like market believe like next year there will be 1% of the growth in GDP, but like central bank expect like 2%, like these two questions. Yeah.
Okay, so excellent. So let me. So I think there are two things. Let me start with the second one, right? Because I think a lot of what I was trying to say is there are two different ways to think about monetary shocks, right? There are monetary surprises, where that is the central bank surprises markets, and that's a kind of monetary shock, but I think it's a quite narrow kind of definition. I think the kinds of shocks we're looking for are times when the Fed changes policy for reasons unrelated to other things in the economy, and that we think you can use to see what actually happens to the economy. So anyway, so that's just, I think that's quite different. But that comes back to your question about what's going on, how do you think about monetary shocks in a country that has to think more about their exchange rate or international relations or things. So on the one hand, it tells you almost inherently a lot of your monetary shocks are going to be exogenous to your economy, right? It may be, the central bank in the United States does something, and that forces the central bank in some other country to move in some direction, even if it's not what's suggested by their own economic conditions. So in that case, in that sense, it could be you could still get some very useful variation. I think the trouble you have is then, well, maybe those shocks in other countries that are affecting the exchange rate, that are making the central bank do things, are also having effects on the balance of payments and things that the country are doing. So you could still have omitted variable bias. So the answer is it's hard. We could certainly talk more about it and think more about it, but I think it's not hopeless is maybe the optimistic way to go here.
Thanks very much for a very excellent talk. I just have a problem with identification, I think, because 3 of those dates that you put up seem to me to be very close to 3 major events in the globe. So the first oil shock, the strikes following just before the Iranian Revolution, and the second oil shock, which would have some major implications for the U.S. economy. So I wonder, how do you handle that?
So, right. So there is certainly what is true is in these cases they are, the Fed is taking actions. So they're not seeing that these shocks are going to have a direct effect on output or whatever. So to the degree that they are moving, it is for reasons unrelated to these. So I think what you're worried about is kind of accidental correlation, right? You've only got 12 observations. It just so happens, right? You don't have the law of large numbers to rely on here, and so what you have to worry about is, do you have accidental correlation with other things that are moving output, and that could still mess you up, even if we've done a fine job of getting relatively exogenous shocks. You could have this accidental correlation. The answer is we've tested for this. So for example, we've tried putting in oil prices as well. So just have a direct measure of oil price shocks. And it doesn't drive out the effects of the monetary shocks. But I think that's But
they become smaller, no? They should presumably become smaller.
They do. I don't remember the numbers well enough. A little bit.
Let me put it this way. If you take out 73, 74, 78, and 79, what would happen? That was sort of my question. I mean, you don't need to say now, but I'm curious if that's what's...
I'm sure, anytime you've only got 12 observations, it's going to be somewhat sensitive. I think that if you just think about that picture that I showed you of the unemployment rate, it's consistent enough that you would certainly get bigger standard errors, but I don't think it's going to change the results, completely. I know it doesn't change the results completely. And then, but things like, but anyway, so something like the Volcker recession, obviously that's a bigger shock, so it probably does affect the numerical size. It's also the reason in any of our things, we're going to include lags of output just to try to sort of stack the deck at least against the monetary shock. So put in other shocks or put in the own history. But it is certainly an issue anytime you have a small number of observations.
My question is really around if central banks wanted to use this research going forward, is there more that they could do with the evidence and the documenting of their decisions now that would help with future research? If you could have sort of a wish list of what you'd ask for, I guess what would it be?
Actually, this is very amusing because after we did the first paper, so Don Cohn, who went on to become, vice chair of the Federal Reserve, but at the time he was in charge of writing up some of the minutes and things, and he definitely told us that he found himself saying, oh gosh, would Romer and Romer classify what I'm writing here as a shock? So it does make you, it could make our approach then more difficult if they're thinking the same way. So I think the main thing, so what we want is for policymakers to leave an honest record of what they were doing. And so it's transcripts, it's things where they're saying what they actually think, and then obviously, anyway, so I think that would be the main thing in sort of how they could keep a record that we could then use better. I think the big picture, it almost gets lost if you're an economist. You just know that identification is hugely important. We've got to know the direction of causation. For someone that doesn't naturally think that way, I think the way this really matters is exactly for what do policymakers, how seriously do they take the decisions that they make, right? So if you think, if you look at a VAR and you say, if we move the interest rate, it's not going to do much, it gives you a whole different sense of how important is this, how forward-looking should I be, how much should I think about this, versus if, a large fraction of the business cycles that we've had to live through over the last 50 years are the result of monetary policy. You should lay awake at night at the sheer awesomeness of your power and make sure you do it right? So I think it does change how policymakers think about their decisions, and it also is going to affect sort of what's the size of the movements you need and all of that. But that's a great question.
Thank you. I got just kind of curiosity. You got 12 exogenous kind of monetary shocks. And I got, and you show us kind of the narrative evidence for one of those in 72, in which the bank is implementing an exogenous monetary shock because they think that the government might want them to do that. Is that correct?
That's the, I didn't have a good quote for you. It's in the context of we need to get the unemployment rate down. So the particular shock that I got, and it's the president and Congress want the unemployment rate down too.
So I got kind of two questions, just kind of, I know 12 shocks is not enough kind of points to really answer, but do you sense that the Federal Reserve is becoming more independent? And the second thing, do you think that is changing? As in, do you kind of observe more contractionary shocks at the beginning and more expansionary shocks at the end? As in, how the Federal Reserve thinks about itself?
Okay, so excellent. I think what is true is in the early part of the post-war period, what seems to be happening is we don't have monetary policy down, right? We go through periods where we run policy that's too loose, they get inflation, at some point they say, oh, I can't take it anymore, we're going to get it down, right? So that's what a lot of our early monetary shocks are of, we screwed up, we've gotten this, the prevailing rate of inflation at full employment is just higher than we like, so we don't have any better way to get it down than to throw the economy into a recession. And certainly one of the things that we think has happened over time is the Fed has gotten better, that they don't tend to cause, and I think this is true of most modern central banks, they don't cause the same boom in inflation, and so they don't have to create recessions to get it down. So I would expect fewer of these contractionary monetary shocks in the future if they're not, sort of having the problem of letting inflation get out of control. In terms of, is the Fed becoming more or less independent? I mean, well, certainly what you see in the 1972, and it is, if there's one central banker that does seem to be kowtowing to the political forces, it is Arthur Burns, right? So I think that he is somewhat unusual compared to others. But certainly the Fed became more independent, I would say, in the 80s and 90s. And I think it is still quite independent despite our, I won't go any further, but you know what I was going to say. So